Mr. Chair, first I'd like to acknowledge the willingness of Mr. Pistole to help in the airport security issues surrounding the perimeter and tarmac issues, and I'd like to publicly acknowledge that. My question is more general, and I think it would be directed at Mr. Pistole, and that is, there's been discussion this morning about the increased threats relating to the events of the last few days and the killing of Osama bin Laden, but it was just a few weeks ago that the Secretary of Homeland Security told us that at no time since 9/11, this is prior to the more immediate events, at no time since 9/11 has this country been in greater danger. And I wanted to ask you if that includes as well these increased threats. Does that also include threats to mass transit? Particularly, my concern is in the light of what's going on in the rest of the world with increased targets being bus, rail, and other factors, ports. So I wanted you to just address, from your perspective in mass transit, is that consistent as well, or is it greater even in terms of the Secretary's remarks of the greater threats we're facing right now?
Thank you, Congressman Keating. I think we are in one of those periods of time where there are so many unknowns, so many variables, that we are all trying to ensure that we are vigilant as to those things that have not come up on the intelligence community or law enforcement community's radar, whether it's a lone wolf, as was mentioned earlier, somebody who may be either inspired by what's happened in this past week to take action on their own. Without going into detail, of course, there are no specific threats to mass or rail transit right now in the U.S. We are very mindful about what has happened around the world, particularly since the Madrid bombing back in '04. And so that is, we see those vulnerabilities. We see what's happened in Moscow, in the subway there. We see what, of course, other places already mentioned. So I think it's a relative term or assessment as to, are we more vulnerable now or less? The bottom line is we are concerned today, just as we were yesterday and will be tomorrow, that terrorists are trying to hurt us, to try to kill us in any means, mode that they can, and recognizing that transportation is one of those key vulnerabilities that we know both Al-Qaeda, core Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden, Zawahiri, and all the others, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as we've seen with the cargo plot and the underwear plot coming out of AQAP. We know that those are key modes that they are trying to affect not only our livelihood, and as Administrator Fugate mentioned about the terrorist impact, but our economy. We saw from Inspire magazine, $4,200, on the cargo plot is all it costs them, and yet the billions that could impact the global supply chain. So those are all things we're focused on.
And quickly, I think this relates to funding as well, but we've been told that there's greater concern about domestic-based threats. And it would seem to me that mass transit targets would be easier, for lack of a better word, for domestic-based threats than others. So with that as a greater threat, and that's been consistently told to us, that there's concern for domestic-based terrorism. Is it a feeling of yours that you are a higher level target as a result of domestic-based threats than perhaps other types of threats?
Well, yeah, absolutely, Congressman. I mean, it complicates it. We're not just looking for those coming from overseas that may be more or easier to identify, hopefully, but with over 300 million people here, based on my experience in the FBI and all the investigations that we had on people who are homegrown or facilitators, enablers, whatever, providing material support. And of course, just going back to what we've seen with Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City and Eric Rudolph and the clinic bombings in the South, or Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. We have people born and raised here that have caused us harm and killed hundreds of people, so that is equally of concern.
Great. I yield back the rest of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. And the gentlelady from California, Ms.